Hey guys, I'm Ted and welcome back to our lecture series, and we are about to wrap up our final lecture regarding the United States Civil War. We're going to wrap up our final lecture and our reflection on the United States Civil War. Big day for me, very happy day for me. So it was a labor of love to write the lectures and to record the lectures. Basically all day type of labor of love for me. But happy dive into our last lecture. I'd like to do a customary recap and just touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we began going through the process of analyzing the causes of the United States Civil War. We looked at the outbreak. We looked at the outbreak and of the war. We looked at the causes of the war. We looked at slavery in particular. We saw that suppressing slavery, abolishing slavery was not a stated goal of the United States at the onset of the war. The United States only gradually came to make slavery a war aim following the Emancipation Proclamation and the Battle of Antietam. And even then, it was issued as a war aim of the war, a wartime measure, a wartime necessity to sort of remove slavery from the industrial capacity and the agrarian capacity of the Confederate States to supply themselves and to keep the war going, to sort of block and to stop the Confederate States from being able to block and stop the Confederate States from being able to rely on slave power to oppose the United States federal or central government. We looked at the argument of the Confederate apologists who argued states' rights. We analyzed states' rights and found that even if you accept the argument of states' rights, the right that the states were initially succeeding to defend was the right to hold slave property. We also, before we braked in our last lecture, we looked at what was the economic situation looked like. What the break over economic issues, and examining that, we saw that the economic systems were quite complementary to each other, and that they worked in tandem to reinforce each other. And more importantly, we also observed that the United States, the northern states, the free states, were not overwhelmingly industrial. As a matter of fact, they were overwhelmingly agrarian, like their southern counterparts. In many ways, the Republic was still the agrarian paradise that Jefferson had grew up in. Jefferson and his contemporaries, like John Adams, it was still that type of agrarian paradise. And now, with all that being said, I'd like to dive right into our lecture, and we begin by looking at the view that there were two alien societies in the United States by 1860. A lot of historians hold the view that the United States really were two different societies with separate political, economic, social, and intellectual beliefs. A slave society that was rural, paternalistic, and caste-based, with slavery having social and economic functions have related to the maintenance of the slavocrats' control over their slaves and maintaining their deferential social position. Now, the slave states did not have a large African American population or slavocrats. In the slave states, there existed a bustling city-based commercial structure that developed in a tie between the rural farmers and the industrial worker and the industrialist, in which those three segments of the Free State Society worked hand in hand with each other. Farmers would send in raw goods to the industrialist. The industrialist hired the industrial worker to process those goods. The goods that were processed, that were created by the industrial workers, were then sold by the industrialist to the farmers. They sort of worked in a system like that, in this nice little, well, it wasn't nice and it wasn't little, but they sort of worked in that sort of nice, well, again, can't say nice, they sort of worked in that structure, in that early industrial structure. Now this is not the case. Well, that is the case for the North, but it isn't the case to say that there were two alien societies. Slave states were peopled by a rural aristocracy, and the free states did maintain a large city-based working middle class, burgeoning middle class. Furthermore, the free states exhibited just as much racist tendencies against African Americans as the slave states. Free states also had Jim Crow forerunner laws before secession. Similarities between the free states and the slave states were striking. They were both dominated by people that drew pride in defining themselves as citizens of the United States, a nation that they saw devoted to the principles of economic opportunity and representative government, as well as individual liberty. Now, liberty is an interesting topic to go to. It is an interesting factor into examining the Civil War. Now, the crux of the issue in many people's eye, then and now, was that one group was engaging in a practice of actively suppressing liberty, and these perceptions loomed large. The slave states believed that Lincoln and the Republicans had a secret plan to abolish slavery. They charged that the Republican Party would abolish slavery and institute a political reorganization that would see African Americans come to rule and lord over them in the South, in those southern slave states. In the free states, they came to believe increasingly in a slave power conspiracy. And the ultimate goal of this slave power conspiracy was that the slave states would use slave power. They would use the great economic advantage that their slaves gave them to spread slavery into every state. That is a very interesting argument. Fanaticism is another argument put forward as a reason or a rationale for the outbreak of the war. What the fanaticism argument, the case is made that pro-slavery fanatics, fanned by false perceptions of reality, sort of went on an unchecked political agitation campaign on both sides, and headlined the spiral toward this union, and that they were aided in this by ineffectual political leaders. Now, when you examine this, and when you look at the works of writers, historical writers and historians who support this view, you tend to look at the first 7 presidents, from Washington to Jackson. Some people exclude Jackson, but I think Jackson exuded enough control to merit him with the rest of those early presidents. These early presidents also had leading figures like John Marshall and Alexander Hamilton. And these early presidents and these early leading figures had the ability to contain the emotion and to react to political realities as needed. This group, they contrast with the group of politicians and leaders from Martin Van Buren to James Buchanan, and they also contrast them with the leading figures like Stephen Douglas and Roger B. Taney, who failed to meet the challenge and fanned the flames of sectionalism. Now, we have to be cautious when examining this view, the fanaticism view. All societies live by different values that change over time. Nobody could have foreseen that this union would follow Lincoln's election. We cannot be fooled by looking backward into history when about we cannot be fooled when looking backward and evaluating these events. With this view that came into prominence in the twilight of the 20th century, historians began to reevaluate the underlying ideology, the ideological system of the United States and of the early 19th century. Now, when we look at the ideology of the United States in the early 19th century, we come to see that it was created in the age of Jackson. That is during the major political relevancy of Andrew Jackson. Citizens of the United States developed a belief that there should be no exterior impediments to their individual and collective destinies. Now, the problem with that thinking is that in the free states and the slave states, people now define their destinies differently. A slave owner's right to his property and to the free movement of his slave property collided square on with a free soiler's right to exist in a free market of equals, where he would not have to worry about competing with slave owners or slave labor. Slavery conflicted with the free states' perceptions of the right of all that all humans possessed. Now this is summed up best by David Bryan Davis, who wrote in the 4 decades before the Civil War, there had been an overleaping of boundaries of every kind and a growing belief that the American people as a whole, like the American individual, were free from the burdens of the past. And that means that they're free from the restrictions that were placed on them by the European kingdoms. They were free to shape their national character. But one problem their ingenuity could not resolve was Negro slavery. Paradoxically, the South increasingly came to regard Negro slavery as the necessary base on which freedom must rest. From the North, a commitment to slavery's ultimate extinction was the test of freedom. Each section detected a fatal change in the other, a betrayal of the principles and mission of the Founding Fathers. Each section feared that the other had transformed into a despotic conspiratorial power. Now, these interpretations that I went over are an example, are an exercise in the study of historical disagreements, and that's called historiography. Really, what all I've said in this lecture, in the past lecture, all they do is champion the view that history is really just subjective and that disagreements are common. Specific interpretations are tied to the era in which they were composed. You must always remember that when evaluating an historical work. It is not accidental that the generation that fought the war would come to view it in the former free states as a struggle against slavery on moral grounds, while in the former slave states it is regarded as a defense of states' rights. You should also not be surprised that the economic interpretation gained traction during the 1930s, when following the collapse of the stock market and the onset of the Great Depression, an area in which writers and thinkers were always thinking, always had economic policies, always had fiscal matters on their mind. When they turned to the Civil War, they decided to apply this new line of thinking to the Civil War. The view that fanatics and underachieving political and national leaders gained traction during the interwar years of the 20th century. Had they looked back at World War I and witnessed the rise of Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Benito Mussolini, historians and writers began to also examine the Civil War. And they looked back and they said that, wow, just as we had these fanatics here, they had these fanatics then. They began to make that correlation. and that correlation was influenced by their historical era. In addition, all of these alternative views of to slavery being the leading cause or the sole cause of the Civil War developed during the height of Jim Crow racism in the United States. This was an area in which African Americans were systematically oppressed, disenfranchised, economically marginalized, and largely removed from the history of the United States. This was an era in which there was a very conscious effort to do these sort of things. This was an effort in which a lot of Dixiecrats, that is, Southern politicians, went out of their way to sort of paint the Civil War in a more positive, more reflective light. They went out to paint the Confederate States into a better light. It didn't work. A lot of northern communities still had very hard feelings towards the Confederate States, and a lot of Northerners, while not accepting, while most of them didn't accept slavery or even the role of African Americans because they themselves were embracing Jim Crow racism, they did not accept a complete beautification of the Civil War, and they still drummed it up with they still summed up the Civil War with slavery being abolished at the end of the war, with the abolishment of slavery being an outcome of the war looming large. Now, the reemergence of slavery had a moral issue and race relations during the Civil War. That it shouldn't come as a surprise that those platforms emerged during the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s. That those things should not be a shock. And the development of the ideological interpretation should not come as a surprise either. The ideological interpretation gained major traction and was well articulated during the Cold War. It was presented and really expanded upon during the Cold War. And the Cold War, of course, was a period of intense global ideological struggles between the capitalist West on the one hand and the communist East on the other. Now, it is interesting to note that if you accept the ideological argument of all the other arguments, if you do accept the ideological argument, all the other arguments retain their validity. Their validity. If you say there was no proof of sectional conspiracies, there was no chance of slavery being abolished in the slave states, or spreading or spreading slavery into the free states, that there was no irreconcilable differences in the competing economic systems or differences in the view of the purpose of the republic. Americans in 1860 believed otherwise. It wouldn't have mattered what you told them; they believed it otherwise. They were ideologically predisposed to viewing things that way. They would have said, "You're lying to me," and they would have walked off, or they would have tried to fight you, called you a devilish rogue or a scoundrel, and tried to fight you. They would not have allowed that for you to just say that. They believed differently. They believed otherwise. Because of their respective ideologies, they acted on those beliefs. Ideology is also linked to all the previously cited factors as reason for the outbreak of war, such as economics, politics, social structure, and understanding of liberty and personal and national rights. Now, the lone common denominator linking all of these factors is slavery. Slave labor was the base of the southern states' economy. The conspiracy theories all rested on slavery's expansion or abolition. Slave state social order was a system of racial hierarchy with large slave owners, slave masters at the top, and slaves on the bottom. The fact that only those of African descent could be enslaved, and that there were laws that allow free men and women to be enslaved, made a racial caste that made all African Americans continually inferior to European Americans, regardless of wealth, education, or education in the slave states. Pro and anti-slavery emotions inspired the fanatics on both sides in Kansas to enact violence towards each other. Citizen rights, the rights of the citizens to do what they want, on where they could take their slave property and why they should not have to compete with slaves. Political arguments, especially after the Mexican War, were centered on slavery. The entire situation in America, in the United States in America, the entire situation is expressed rather simplistically but perceptively by President Lincoln in a letter from 1860 in which he said, "You think slavery," and he's speaking to a Southerner. He's speaking to a slave state man. "You think slavery is right and ought to be extended, while we think slavery is wrong and ought to be restricted." That right there summed it all up. That right there sums everything about the Civil War up. And that brings our lecture to a close. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about the Civil War presentation. Let me know what you thought about the reflections of the Civil War. As always, I'm Ted, and I will see you guys for our next lecture.